Colin's Last Stand is a fan-funded endeavor. If you like any, some, or all of CLS's shows, the original historical and political Colin's Last Stand, the conversational podcast Fireside Chats, or the video game-centric SideQuest, please consider supporting Colin's Last Stand on Patreon at patreon.com/ColinsLastStand. Doing so can net you lots of cool perks, like determining topics for future videos, early access to podcasts, exclusive Q&As, producer credits, and much more. Thank you for your kindness, consideration, and generosity. Now, on to the show. Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Colin's Last Stand right here on YouTube. My name is Colin Moriarty. It's great to be back. I hope all of you out there are doing very well, that this video finds you well, and that the holiday season treated you most splendidly. Today's video is a complicated one, at least in premise. It's about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that has been raging since before World War II, but really since 1947 and 1948. And this topic was determined by the audience over at patreon.com/ColinsLastStand, who voted for me to do this video. And I had a hard time doing it. I had a hard time writing this script. It was getting out of control. The research was getting out of control. It was getting too long. So I truncated it down to something that I think is manageable, like basically a primer about what the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is all about. And the idea of the video is simply so that you can walk away with just a little bit more knowledge, if you didn't know already, about where this comes from and how we got to this point. It's less about today and more about yesterday. And I think that that's a pretty good way to go about doing this video. So I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you on the other side. Let's jump in. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict takes up tons of oxygen in the geopolitical space, no matter where you hail from, and no matter which side, or both, or neither you support. What's shocking about the conflict, however, is how little so many people know about it, and yet so much of what goes on around the world in some way runs through Israel, a small country on the eastern bank of the Mediterranean Sea, a country just slightly bigger than the state of New Jersey, with a population 8.8 million, that's similar in size to that of the state of Virginia. Israel is geographically small with an equally small population, yet it looms gigantically on the international stage. That's because it has serious disagreements with its territorial neighbors, the Palestinians, and by proxy the rest of the Arab world, in which it sticks out like a sore thumb. Likewise, it's an utterly unique country, a shining democracy surrounded by all matter of less than desirable governments, a country that just so happens to share a significant economic, political, social, and military bond with the world's most powerful nation, the United States. It's through this lens that we examine the situation as it stands. To understand what's going on between Israel and Palestine, you first have to understand the deep and twisted history that brought us to the year 1947, because it's in that year that the drama really begins. More on that in a bit. For the purposes of this video, we're not going to comb through literal ancient history, because it's unnecessarily complex for a simple primer such as this. But it's important to note that both Palestinians and Israelis lay claim to at least portions of current-day Israel, through established historical roots that stretch back thousands of years. For Jews, it goes even deeper because their tether to the land isn't only historical, but biblical. Indeed, the term Israel was a largely abstract noun outside of the Torah until the late 19th century. Israel is a simple catch-all term for land that was at one time known as Samaria or Judea, or a host of other names you've probably heard in both religious and historical terms. The Roman Empire put an end to all that those names represented a couple thousand years ago, though, and until World War II loomed frighteningly on the horizon, a return of the Jewish people to their once homeland was nothing but a dream. The Palestinians, on the other hand, had been living within this geopolitical ground zero for centuries, and while it's essential to note that there has never been a country known as Palestine, the Palestinians as a somewhat amorphous group have been long recognized, if not as a people, then as a people living within a territory known colloquially as Palestine. Palestinians are Arab Muslims in stark contrast to a majority of Israelis, who are, in essence, largely Europeans of the Jewish faith. Though it's worth noting that a significant portion of the aforementioned Israeli population, perhaps 15% of it, is both Arab and Muslim. So Israel isn't quite as uniform as it may seem from the outside, but that's not what's even at the heart of this conflict. At the heart of this conflict is land, particularly locales on the western bank of the Jordan River, known quite literally as the West Bank. But let's not get too ahead of ourselves here, without first explaining how the Jewish faith was drawn back to this area to begin with. And to understand that, you need to understand the rise of European antisemitism beginning in the late 19th century, and how a large portion of the global Jewish population began to look at the term Judaism as referencing both a religion and a race. Antisemitism, the hatred of the Jewish people and all things Jewish, has deeper roots than the 19th century, but in reality, it was the prevalence of the anti-Semitic movement among portions of the European intelligentsia, European politicians, and various European populations that really got the ball nefariously rolling. Naturally, this all culminated with the Holocaust, which took place with World War II raging in the background. Nazi Germany exterminated millions of Jewish people from the mid-1930s to the mid-1940s in an attempted cleansing of Europe of a scapegoated people who were widely blamed for all the ills that befell Germany and the countries in its orbit, particularly in the wake of the Great Depression. Jewish people and Jewish interests were blamed for everything, from economic despair and out-of-control inflation to the untimely surrender of Germany in World War I, which ultimately brought about Nazism to begin with. Anti-Semitism was a very real, very dangerous, and very unfortunate reality of the European landscape leading up to World War II, when the awful rhetoric turned to terrible action. Slowly but surely, Jewish people were stripped of their rights, their businesses, their homes, their money, their possessions, their right to move and travel freely, and, in the end, their very right to live. But many saw the writing on the wall, even before Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party seized control in 1933. And once the Nazis came to power and began to enact policies precisely as outlined by Adolf Hitler in the years leading up to the Reichstag fire, even more people saw the writing on the wall. Not enough to avoid calamity, but enough to support what's known as Zionism, the idea that a maligned, mistreated, and unfairly distrusted Jewish people should return to the ancient homeland once occupied by their forefathers. Why? Because it was the only way they'd survive the hostility the world had been showing them. The slow but steady trickle of Jews that went to the Middle East before World War II fully broke out following the Nazis' invasion of Poland in 1939 was facilitated by the convenient fact that the British, post-World War I, controlled as an occupying power the land they themselves termed Palestine. Plus, there simply weren't all that many Jews there, a number far off from the nearly 9 million there now, perhaps 25 times less in fact. In other words, the fuse was lit, but it was long. There were bigger fish to fry. Once the Nazi fish was fried, however, peacetime brought about complicated questions. Among them, what should happen to the Jewish people that, in front of the entire world, were nearly exterminated from existence, if not for the Allied victory that halted Nazism's deadly march? A decent base of Jews had been living in British Palestine for decades by the time the infamous year 1947 rolled around, a year I earlier told you that was at the very center of everything. It was at this point that the newly formed United Nations, an organization sprouted from the ashes of not one, but 2 world wars, provided a way forward. 2 states, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians. Israel and Palestine would sit side by side, wedged between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Most important members of that early UN wanted this plan, as did the Israelis. Arab member states and what would become the Palestinian Authority didn't want the plan. This moment in 1947 is one of the most consequential slices of time in human history. If the Palestinians accepted the terms, decades upon decades of bloodshed, quarreling, bickering, and nonsense could have been, and probably would have been, avoided. The Middle East could have looked radically different. Its relationship to the Western world likely would be radically different. But alas, that's not where we find ourselves. This isn't to say that the Palestinians necessarily made the wrong choice, and obviously it had plenty of local backing in its decision. But it's sad that the only viable option that exists today to solve the nonsense once and for all, a 2-state solution, is virtually identical to what was offered in 1947, and in fact was floated in some way, shape, or form even before World War II began. The collapse of the original 2-state solution didn't stop Israel from declaring its independence as a sovereign nation, however, and in May of 1948, Israel as we know it leaped into existence. Soon thereafter, Israel was invaded by 5 separate Arab-led militaries that wished to extinguish the nation-state from existence. Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt lost the conflict to Israel, and they lost badly. In an ironic twist, the war's outcome meant that Israel was now territorially larger than it would have been had the Palestinians accepted the previous year's offer, and the attack on Israel battle-tested what would become the fearsome and well-respected Israeli Defense Force for the very first time, while further galvanizing Israeli and global Jewish opinion on the situation in staunch support of a Jewish state. As a result of Israel successfully defending itself and rebuffing its neighbors, deep animosity was sown even deeper and became the generational plague it still is today. The cycle began to spiral out of control at this point. Trust was eroded, respect was non-existent, and Israel sat surrounded by enemies that had attacked it. Israel and Egypt came to blows again in the 50s, forcing the UN to step in and keep the peace. In 1967, the bloodshed was renewed when Israel attacked Egypt in what it claimed were preemptive strikes to protect itself and its economic and political sovereignty. This is known as the 6 Days War, and the aftermath of the brief conflict has left everything pretty much exactly as we find it today. The West Bank, the ostensibly Palestinian locale at the eastern edge of Israel that Israelis have occupied since '67, is at the very nexus of the continuation of this saga, because Israel doesn't only militarily occupy it, but actually allows Jewish settlers to call portions of it home. The recent UN drama about Jerusalem as the Israeli capital city also connects to this. Jerusalem sits snugly in between what would and should be Palestine and Israel, and the city was originally going to be controlled by an international peacekeeping force, per the original 1947 two-state plan. The good news is that the situation has mellowed out at least a little bit. The Gaza Strip, which Israel occupied simultaneously along with the West Bank in 1967, was abandoned by the Israeli Defense Force in 2005. Now we wait for a solution we once hoped and perhaps still hope would spin out of the Oslo Accords, which are now 25 years old. The so-called land for peace swap, that Israel would cede control of the West Bank back to the Palestinians, Palestine would get its own state, and Israel would exist in a pre-1967 configuration while going unmolested by incessant Palestinian terrorist attacks that persist to this day, is what would presumably come from it. But in reality, it's conceivable that the madness never ends. Distrust remains high, the United States' involvement in the process remains controversial and contentious, and Israel's neighbors are pretty much universally hostile, unless an enemy of an enemy becomes a friend, which is why Saudi Arabia and Israel are on good terms. They both hate Iran, after all. And so all we can do is hope and pray for a peaceful, equitable solution to one of history's most festering issues. That's it for this episode of Colin's Last Stand. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it informative. Please share it with friends and family. Leave comments below if you liked it or you didn't. Thumb up the video if you liked it. Thumb it down if you didn't. I'll be very interested to see what you have to say about this particular episode. Anyway, I will see you next time for more Colin's Last Stand. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Keep on learning.